Hello, fellas. We're today going to talk a little bit about working on bicycles. We're not going to cover every little thing or every technological advance that has occurred over the years of the bicycle, but some of the things that you might run into. First one is flat tire or changing a tire. Kind of teaching the same thing at the same time. But what happens if you have a flat tire? Obviously, you lose pressure in your tire and not only lose the ability to roll, but also the stability of your bicycle. So, what do you do when you get a flat? Well, the first thing obviously you do is you remove the wheel from your bicycle. That's the easiest thing to do. And then, if there happens to be any air left in the tire, this one is soft, as you can see, but still is holding some pressure. So you want to remove all the pressure that you can from the tire by pressing on the valve stem right here. This happens to be a Presta valve. The Schrader valves have the needle inside the valve stem itself instead of exposed like this. Anyway, this is a tire that has a tube in it. And so what you want to do is unseal or break the bead, as they say, of the tire on the rim. Sometimes they'll stick over extended use and installation. And some tires you can actually take off the rim just by pulling on one side and working it over with your thumbs. I'm not going to show you that right now, but I will show you that you can use a tool called a tire lever. They usually come in pairs or threes. Don't use a screwdriver to do this next thing or any sharp implement like that. You want to use a nice softly rounded tool made specifically for removing the beads from the rims. So what you'll do is you'll insert the rounded portion in under the bead of the tire over the rim and then just lever it out. And these are set up so that the little hook can hook on the spoke. Well, you get your next tire lever, insert it right next to the first one, and then you can slide it around. Some tires are easier to do this with than others. Just slide it all the way around and pull that bead on the outside of the rim. Okay. The next thing you want to do, if you're just changing a flat, is pull the tube out. So you go opposite the valve stem and stick your fingers in there and you'll feel the inner tube and just peel that out. And if it's been in there a while, it might be a little stuck in there, but just peel it out. And when you get around to the valve stem, what you want to do is expose the inside of the stem by peeling the tire back the other way and pulling that out of the rim. Now, what do? Well, a lot of people just replace the tube. Some people patch them. If you're going to replace the tube and just throw this one out, you can cut it up into little sections and make rubber bands. They come in very handy sometimes. Or you can use it in its entirety and actually hang things like extension cords, coiled extension cords or whatever, hang them. So they have a lot of uses. Or you can patch the tube with a patch kit and put it reinstall it. So what do we look for if you've got a flat? Obviously the first thing you're going to look for is what caused the flat. So you'll look around and you'll see if there's anything visible in the outside of the tread. Often, it can be a thumbtack, it can be a nail, a piece of a staple or a sharp piece of metal. Glass is also very common. And if you don't see anything visible readily from the outside always what you want to do is stick your fingers inside and very carefully run around the tread and see if there's anything sharp. And you want to be careful because you can cut your hand, but see if there's anything sharp protruding on the inside. So if it's a thumbtack and you pull the thumbtack out, you might assume that I found the cause for my flat tire, pull it out and replace or fix the tube, reinstall it, and you're all set. But sometimes it'll be a small piece of glass or a small piece of metal that'll work its way into the tread, and as you ride, it works its way in further and further and further until it just barely protrudes on the inside of the tire, and you can no longer see it on the outside of the tire. So running your fingers around will help you hopefully find that offending object, and you'll want to pick it out of there. Okay, if you're changing the tire, obviously you want to take the tire all the way off the rim and replace it with your new tire or whatever tire you want. Now some tires have an actual direction of rotation arrow on them, and this is one of those tires that has that, and there's an arrow on here and it says rotation direction, and it's got an arrow pointing that way. So you want to make sure that that arrow is pointing in the direction of rotation as you install the tire on the rim. Okay, so go ahead and you put one side of the tire back on the rim. Okay, and then what you want to do is take your tube, whether it's a fixed flatted tube or a new tube, not a U-tube, a new tube, and you'll want to put a little bit of pressure in it, because when you get a new tube it'll be completely flat, all void of air. So you want to put just a little bit of pressure in there, just enough to pump it up and give it shape. Okay, and then I always go around and with my hand I wipe it down just to make sure that nothing got stuck to it from the ground, a piece of gravel or anything, because that too can cause you grief later on. So what you want to do is find the hole where the valve stem goes in your rim, and just like we did last time on the removal, pull the tire back away from that hole, insert the valve stem into that hole, and then get the tube such that it is inside the tire where that valve stem is. Okay, and then just go work your way around, tucking that lightly pressurized tube into the tire. Try to get it so it doesn't twist or it doesn't have any wrinkles in it. Just tuck it up inside there. Okay, and sometimes when you put a little bit of pressure in, the tube is going to seem a little bit longer than it needs to be to fill the tire. If that's the case, you probably have a little too much pressure in there, and you should let some out. Okay, so the tube, as you can see, is all concealed within the tire now. It's not twisted, no wrinkles, and then we just go around and make sure that that tube is, we'll say, in the groove of the rim. Okay, I should mention the other thing that you'll want to check if your flat doesn't appear to be from the tread. Sometimes it can be from a spoke protruding through too far to the inside, and it will violate what is called this rim tape. Now some rim tape is rubber or vinyl or polyethylene. This happens to be a cotton, adhesive back cotton, and you'll want to go around and make sure that there's nothing sharp protruding that way. You shouldn't have that problem, generally speaking, on a wheel that you bought from a professional. So here's the valve stem. And what you want to do is now push that valve stem up a little bit into the tire, and with your thumbs squeeze the tire so that it will sit down, that bead, that inside diameter will sit down inside the valve stem. Okay? If you don't push that valve stem up, sometimes it'll get caught underneath the bead and prevent the tire from seating properly, and you'll get a tire that kind of goes like this as you're riding, which you don't want. So just work your way around, thumb, forefingers. Most tires, especially ones that are designed to have tubes in them, you can easily or reasonably easily put on, just working them with your thumb and forefingers like that. Okay, so go around, make sure that the tube is fully seated all the way around, or that the tire is fully seated all the way around. And then sometimes doing that, you'll get a point where the valve stem tilts a little bit like that. Just move the tire around until it's straight. If it's tilted too much, you can put stress on that valve stem and cause it to fail inside, and cause yourself a leak that way. Anyway, once you get that installed, you want to pressurize it. And again, on the sidewall of the tire will be the recommended inflation pressures. And you want to use a gauge to do that. This one happens to be 100 psi. You may hear some pops as the tire is seating itself. What you want to do when you get it partially pressurized is look around, make sure that the tire is seated all the way around and that it's not popping the bead out of the rim. And then continue to pressurize the tire. I don't know if you can hear it creaking, but that's just the bead seating in the rim. Okay. That is fully pressurized, fully repaired wheel. 100 psi. And again, you want to look and make sure there's no bulges or places where the bead is sticking on the outside of the rim. It doesn't look right. Okay, and then you're all set to reinstall the wheel into your bicycle. Okay, now that we know how to repair a flat, we should talk a little bit quickly about how to remove a wheel from the frame so that it can be easily repaired. Some people will actually do the repair with the wheel on the bicycle. It's a lot easier, and you can find it much easier to thoroughly inspect the parts to make sure you don't have the flat again. So I'll show you first how to remove the front wheel, and then we'll go and remove the back wheel. Very similar. Of course, the back wheel has the drivetrain involved, so it's a little more step involved. But so the first thing most bikes you have to do, and whether it's a mountain bike or a road bike or a old cruiser, anything like that, what you'll want to do, usually you have to release the brake pads so that they don't prevent you from removing the tire. It's not so much a problem when you have a flat tire because you can squeeze that closed, but when it's pumped up, it's sometimes difficult to get the tire past the brake pads. So the way you do that on most bicycles, these brakes here are called cantilever brakes. So they're attached to the fork here, and they pivot around the pedestal on the fork, and then they have a cable yoke that when pulled up squeezes the brakes to the rim. So what you want to do is pull on the release side of this cable yoke here. There's usually a little finger feature that allows you to pull on it, and then you just take that out of the slot and the brakes release like so. Now you need to release the wheel from the frame. Now this is a quick release axle, which means there's a lever on the far side here, and you relax that lever, and most forks have tabs on them, whether they're molded into the fork dropout themselves or whether they're little extra stamped metal tabs that engage into slots in the fork. That's to prevent the wheel from coming out if you happen to have forgotten to tighten the nuts or the quick release lever. Okay, and then you just work the wheel out, and it comes out like so. And as you can see, here's that quick release lever I was talking about, and here's the wheel ready for repair if you need to do that. Okay, proper adjustment of the quick release. How do you know when tight is tight enough? So the first thing you do is you reinstall the wheel into the fork dropouts, and then you'll want to orient the lever how you want it oriented. And then the idea is that you'll tighten the nut on this side with the lever sticking parallel to the axle of the quick release. Make sure the wheel is fully seated in those dropouts, and snug up this nut. And what you want to start feeling good resistance when that lever is about parallel to the axle, and then just push it all the way up so that it is now parallel to the fork, if you will. Check to make sure that it's centered, the wheel's centered in the fork, and then of course connect the brakes back again. Make sure they're centered so that you don't have a fork pad rubbing. Now sometimes you'll get squeak from your fork pads, or squeal when you go to stop. If it's something that's there all the time, your brake pads need adjustment. So ideally, the fork pad, which is this black rubberish piece right here, the fork pad, when you squeeze the brakes, will contact at the front of the pad, and there will still be a gap at the back of the pad. Because when you're rolling forward, what that does, it wants to cause the fork pad to angle a little bit, because it's not perfectly tight, and it has a little bit of flex. So the idea is you don't want the whole pad to make contact simultaneously. You want the front to contact just slightly before the rear. Okay. How do you adjust the brakes if they're too loose? Like if your brake lever goes too close to the handlebar or does not provide sufficient stopping. There's a couple ways to do that. Some brakes have a little adjuster right up here at the top of the brake levers, and if you back that out, it effectively lengthens this casing that's around that cable, and thereby it makes the cable seem shorter and it brings the pads closer to the rim. Often there's also a thumb screw here on the brake hanger, that's called, where you can back that out and do the same thing. Just some terminology. Of course, everybody knows handlebars, brake levers, brake hoods, okay, cables, brake cables. This is called the steering tube right here. Fork we talked about. Fork crown is this area right here. This is called a down tube. So this bike, you can see the shift levers are on the end of the handlebars. Those are called bar end shifters. Okay. Sometimes on some older racing bikes you may see that there's little levers right down here, kind of where these points are, that used to actuate the cables for shifting, and those were called down tube shifters. And the reason they're called down tube shifters is because they are shifters on the down tube. It's called the down tube, steering tube, top tube, seat tube, and where the seat tube and the down tube come together, and the crank, this is the crank, goes through to the other side. That's called the bottom bracket. That housing is called the bottom bracket. These are called seat stays and chain stays. And then the features where the wheels set into the fork there and into the back of the rear triangle here are called dropouts. I think because when things are loose, your wheels drop out. Anyway, so I told you we'd do the rear wheel next. The only trickier thing about this is if you happen to have a pair of gloves or a paper towel with you, you might want to use them. If you're going to take this out again, release the brakes, just like we did on the front. It's exactly the same. And then you'll want to make sure that your chain is located on the smallest sprocket in the rear or furthest outboard. And then you want to put your chain on this little feature that on some bikes anyway is on the seat stay called a chain hanger. Okay, and then just like the front, you release the quick release lever and pop the wheel out. You may have to hold the derailleur back to clear the chain from the sprockets or the cogs. And there you go. That's the rear wheel. This is called a cassette. Okay. And that's that. To reinstall, same kind of thing as the front with the added complexity of this rear derailleur and chain. Just the opposite of removing, reinstall. And make sure it's all the way up into the dropouts. Again, all the way up, centered, and then you can reset your quick release lever, just like that. And again, make sure your brakes are reconnected. And I can see that this wheel, not too bad, but it has a little wow to it as it goes around, so it needs to be trued. That's a little bit more advanced, but you do that by tightening and loosening spokes in a magical way to get the wheel to run true. Okay. What's next? These are called seats or saddles. Okay. And water bottle cages to carry water for some longer trips. These kind of pedals, you can see they don't look very comfortable for riding around in tennis shoes. They're set up specifically for riding in shoes that have a special cleat in them that actually snaps in the spring-loaded pedal. And the shoes have a very stiff sole so that it distributes the load of the pedal across the sole of your foot. Okay. Again, this is called the crank, and these are called chain rings. This bike happens to have 3. 1, 2 that the chain is on right now, and then the third one, this really small one here. Okay. This is called the front derailleur. And this front derailleur is controlled by the left shifter, always. No matter what kind of bike you have, if you have a front derailleur, it's controlled by the left, the same way the front brake is controlled by the left brake lever. Okay? And really, there's only 2 or maybe 3 things that you ever have to worry about on the derailleur. And one of those is to keep it clean and lubricated. The other is if it's not shifting right, like it doesn't go far enough up or far enough down or inboard or outboard, or maybe it goes too far outboard and your chain comes off the outside of this chain ring. So when you're trying to get up into that top gear, maybe the chain over travels off to the outside, and there's an adjustment on the derailleur to prevent that so that it won't over travel to the outside. And on the tops of the derailleurs there's 2 small screws, almost always Phillips head screws. The outer one limits the amount of travel the derailleur can come outboard, and the inner one limits the amount of travel that the derailleur can move inboard. You can adjust those usually enough that the derailleur won't move at all. So it has that much adjustability. But if your chain is not falling off on the inside or the outside, and it travels far enough to engage the inner sprocket or the outer sprocket, you shouldn't have to mess with those limit screws. Okay? The next thing is, does it shift properly into the gears without ratcheting and things like that? So that adjustment, very similar to the brake cable adjustment, is done with some thumb screws. On this bike, they happen to be on either side of the down tube. Of course, the one on the left that comes from the left side shifter to the front derailleur is over here, and then the one for the rear derailleur, which we'll look at in a second, is right here. And those just adjust and effectively lengthen or shorten the cable. Okay. The rear derailleur is set up exactly the same way, and it'll be hard to show, but there's 2 limit screws. They're, again, Phillips head. They're very close together in the rear. 2 Phillips head screws that you can adjust in and out, because you certainly don't want the chain going so far that it goes off the inner cog right here and gets caught in your spokes. That can cause some expensive damage. But it needs to go far enough so that you can easily select the large sprocket and enjoy riding in that gear if you need to. And the same goes with the outboard position. It needs to go far enough, but not too far. And that's what the limit screws are for. And then this bike and most bikes today happen to have what's called index shifting, which means every time you move the shifter a certain amount, you'll get a click. 1 click equals 1 gear change, and you have to be pedaling. But basically 1 click, 1 change. It should happen quickly and cleanly, and for each click, a gear. Okay? No hesitation, and downshifting also. Upshift, going to the inner, downshifting, going to the outer, or vice versa, actually. Okay? So that's that. The other thing you want to do always is keep your chain clean and lubricated. The same with the derailleurs. You want to keep those clean and lubricated. And there's a lot of cleaners for chains, and sometimes even Windex or Spick and Span will work don't mix them with water, just use them straight on a cloth. Put the cloth around the chain, preferably with gloves on, and you can spin forward or backward and get your chain clean just by wrapping the rag around it. And then you'll want to use some reasonable lubricant, preferably something made for chains. Regular oil is too thick for bicycle chains. It doesn't lubricate it that well, and it is extremely good at collecting dirt, which will prematurely wear your chain. Anyway, you just go through, put a drop on every link as it goes by, like that. It takes a while, but you don't have to do it every day. Put on every link, let it sit for a minute, and then take that cleaning rag you used last time and again wrap it around the chain, wipe the chain dry, and that will prevent any excess oil from getting on your braking surfaces or elsewhere on your body or your clothes or your bicycle or anything else you might have that maybe you're carrying on a rack or something. The other important thing about bicycle chains is they do wear out, and when they wear out your chain rings, and they'll wear out the cassette, and eventually it will cause, when you're trying to pedal hard, the chain will skip, and that's a telltale sign that you let your chain go too far. So ideally, what you want to do is take a ruler, an accurate ruler, and measure from the center of a pin that holds the chain together back to the nearest link that matches the 12-inch mark. So from 0 to 12 inches. And if that length, if the closest pin is at a distance greater than 12 1/8, then the chain should be replaced. It's getting too worn to properly run the rest of the drivetrain. So from 12 inches to 12 1/8 inches is an acceptable distance. If you have run too long with a stretched or worn chain, you may also end up having to replace one or multiple gears on the cassette. This part here is called a stem. I know I forgot that before. As you can see, I've got a little computer on here that keeps track of my mileage and my time ridden. And we'll talk a little bit about saddles. I happen to like this style of saddle. It's a Brooks style saddle, hard rubber. There's not padding in it or anything like that. It works really well for me. They don't work well for everybody. If you get into bike riding and like to do it a lot, you'll find over time that you need to find a saddle that fits you and works for you. These happen to work well for me. I will now entertain questions, and we'll go off the recording and talk live. So if you have any questions, now is the time. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.